Hello, everyone. Hello. Is this working? Okay. Hello, everyone. I think we'll get started. Good afternoon. Welcome. This is the panel, Building the Regulatory Standard for Thermal Energy Networks. Appreciate you all attending this 4 o'clock session, the last before happy hour. So I'll just introduce myself. I'm Laurie Kokkinides. I work for the New York State Department of Public Service. Today we will hear from our 4 speakers who are themselves working to build a regulatory framework. The panel will discuss the process to build toward that and arrive at a regulatory framework for TENS. We have experience in Massachusetts and in New York, and so we'll hear from our panel members from both of those states. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Zeyneb.
I got it. I got the name dance part down, so now we see if I remember what my slides were. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Zeyneb Magavi. I'm Executive Director of HEET. And I had the joy of anxiety of first proposing that a gas utility should go to GEO and build a geothermal network back in winter of 2019 to the guy right over there, Bill. So I have this map of the gas network as my background. Imagining what it took to first build that network. Back in the 1800s, it was very cutting edge. I doubt the first pipe was cost effective, just saying. And so looking at the moment now and the opportunity to build, whatever you call them, we'll get to that, geothermal energy networks, I think there's some very high-level things I'm going to start us off with, and then we can get into the details later. So first, really breaking the entire process into 3 parts and not seeing it as a monolith, because it's an awful lot to get from here to there. And a lot of us are in that demonstration stage where we're putting the first one in the ground. And at that stage, I would argue that the ratepayer cost is nominal. It's low. It's a participatory price, not a real price. And that the features of this stage are education, definitions, data gathering, learning, really, and collecting possible approaches. Like, what are the ways forward? And then we're just beginning this next phase in Massachusetts, is the development phase. And this is really important to not think we have to leap from one demonstration to full deployment and know and understand exactly what the ownership structure is, the financing model, the rate-making process, and the approval process. That's crazy, because we won't have the data to do it. In order to get to that deployment phase where we're building all over everywhere and have fixed models, we need to actually do more than one project. We need to build 100 in a region. And again, data. You're just going to hear that from me over and over again. And at that stage where we're coming down the cost and innovation curve and we're learning and we're understanding where and where not and what the factors are, the ratepayer cost, in my opinion, should be fair but not linked to capital cost yet. Not unlike the last few times we've built utilities, which again was way over 100 years ago. And so that development phase is intense data gathering and really strategic testing of possible approaches, models, and factors. And so in that context of demonstration, development, deployment, I want to tackle the hardest problem of all. That's going to get me all kinds of trouble when I walk out of here, I'm totally aware. Clear nomenclature? Uh-oh. So my team and I actually decided to try to do this no matter how much trouble it got us into. And we collected all of the policy, all of the academic papers that referenced, and did a full review. And we had definitions and lack of definitions and different names that we're all over the map for just the US. And different groups are using different language. And in my opinion, this actually makes a lot of regulatory risk, because if you define something or you permission something and it is not, and I'll get into this later, it is not going to deliver the outcomes, if the outcomes are not linked to the definition, you're going to get into trouble. So this is a proposal out of that work for something that is defensible and makes sense. It's not necessarily going to be popular. So going to district energy, where there is a definition for distributed ambient temperature, a decentralized district system, which is 5th generation district and heating cooling, and also a definition for the generations before, 3rd, 4th. That's actually kind of a well-established framework around the world. So then we come along with our thermal energy networks and geothermal networks. You've heard multiple terms. And what are we talking about? Well, mostly we're talking about that 5th generation and decentralized. And then what I have proposed is that since 5th generation can be both 2-pipe and 1-pipe, a thermal energy network, which for most of us infers a potential for utility growth, which is why we have so many gas utility. I'm so going to run out of time. I better speed up. The thermal energy network term can be clearly defined in this way: as a single pipe, decentralized, renewable and combustion fee. And then if it has geothermal energy on it, which is any geothermal, then it can be called a geothermal energy network. So fight with me later, I'm going to keep going. Also of use to regulation is to break apart that one unit of a, whatever you're calling it, thermal energy network, into the different components, because there is the very clear potential that each of them may have different business models, different ownership models, different financing models, different cost curves, and different life cycles. And just to outline the importance of that, I want to point out that almost all of the states in the US use either the 25 or the 30-year life cycle for a ground source heat pump. Has anyone ever stopped to think that the actual life cycle of the borehole is much, much longer than that, and it's the majority of the cost? And yet we are calculating all of our lovely spreadsheets without thinking about that? All right, I'm going to keep going. Another aspect that I think is critical to regulatory consideration is the benefits that we have listed here are all arguably deliverable, not necessarily all in the same ratio or location, or so the question ends up being, which benefits are we to prioritize? And will we monetize them? Because most of them here are not monetized. And some of them, they have money behind them, like your electric grid benefit. I mean, that DOE geothermal heat pump impact report, just for the geothermal heat pump at 68% deployment, was $1.6 trillion net present value in 2050. But we don't have a way to monetize that. So will we monetize safety, security, carbon? I'm going to keep going and leave that there. And one example of a link between terminology, benefits, and regulation is, look at that benefit, scalable and adaptable. Well, that can mean both that you can grow it as a system, utility scale. It can also mean that it can adapt over time as the climate changes or the customers change. And this single pipe system, however we define it, can most easily expand, interconnect, and adapt to meet that parameter. So is that one that is most important to a state? That is a question. 2 minutes. Benefits electric grid. That was another benefit I just mentioned about the money on the table that we do not monetize. And I think that is a really clear near future target for regulation, is to attempt to find a strategic way and try out a couple different ways to capitalize on that outcome. And I think that also brings up the question of scale, because your electric grid benefit on one house scale is a really different thing the minute you scale to the size of, say, a substation. And the costs shift, and it depends on the scale you're looking at. All right, so will geothermal energy networks follow the Wright's law? When you're determining regulation, you're looking at costs, we have to remember we're in an innovation curve, and every one of these other clean techs have followed Wright's law with, I think it's a 20% decrease for every doubling of deployment. Well, Colorado Mesa University had a cost per ton of 7,400, and then the next cost per ton was 3,284. There will be similar numbers coming out of the second loop in Eversource. So the question is, how do you account for that in regulation? How do you both acknowledge that we know the costs are going to be coming down, and what is rational and reasonable for the ratepayer? And one of the things I'm going to leave us with is that critical to this entire set of questions and to getting through that development phase that we are hopefully about to be in is to really have a standardized, normalized, comparative set of data between all of these projects and be able to learn from each other. And HEET will be launching a relational database before the end of the year. We have a beta. And then together with NREL, we have built a techno-economic model that will be open source and also available to ask kind of informed questions about how to scale, which can help us determine rational regulation. And I'm almost on time, maybe? But I'm gonna stop for a second and point out that that's a lot, and there's a lot of very high-level parameters, not in the details yet, which we're gonna get to, but it requires everyone kind of coming together. And that leveling of the benefits, which benefits matter, it really needs all of our voices. It has to matter for society, not just for any one entity. So we all do have to kind of get our boots dirty and come together. And there's always an ask with me, so if you would be willing, we have a geo cost survey to try to build our data set as a community, and it's at that website there. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Akley. I am prior president of Eversource's gas business, 40 years in the industry. I retired in July. I'd be playing golf or pickleball right now if it wasn't for Zeyneb and the wonderful team at HEET, and the wonderful team at Eversource as well. So I just want to provide some perspectives about what we've seen, the path we went through with our regulators up in Massachusetts, and some of the kind of foreshadowing of what we need to be doing going forward. And Zeynep mentioned this, but the learning and accelerated learning is critically important. Sounds very common sense, but this is not an easy thing because each jurisdiction has to deal with some uniqueness, right? So geothermal, based on geology, based on your energy costs, your energy demand, your housing stock, there's a lot of variables here that go into assessing the success or the costs associated with deploying geothermal. So everybody's going to want to test those, but there is a lot of learning, and a lot of credit goes to the team at HEET, the collaborative. There's some 28, almost 30 utilities sharing information. There's conferences like this. This is really, really important. There is some great data and learning, and we need to build off one another, not kind of recreate the wheel. We don't have the time, and there's so much great stuff going on, so many good people involved. I think these forums and the collaborative have really been a great source across the U.S. on sharing what's going on and learning from the pilot, particularly what we've accomplished in Framingham, Mass. When you think about scaling, obviously the first issue is how do you get there and how do you open the door to even do this as a gas utility? For us, we proposed this in a rate case, a formal rate case, and I think there were a lot of benefits to that in Massachusetts because in a rate case, there's a lot of engagement going back and forth with the regulator about questions and interrogatories and data exchanging and what makes sense and what doesn't. And at the end of the day, to me, the Mass DPU and the company, and with the help and support of Bureau Hoppold and the work that HEET sponsored, we had a lot of great data to show there is enough potential benefit here in alignment with greenhouse gas decarbonization policies in the state that this is worth a shot. And I would say the things we spoke about mainly, about where we saw the benefits, they've come true. So the performance of geothermal for this room is probably pretty clear, but it's incredible, especially in a networked, and again, it's called different things, but when you network it and you're seeing COPs of 6+, that's pretty amazing and pretty powerful. So for New England, when you're talking about air source heat pumps, you're in 2 to 3 range or so. So for that alone, you start thinking about the cascading value that not only in the deployment and cost overly of that energy, but how you are lowering the taxing of the electric grid and all the investments required on the electric side. Workforce transition for a gas utility. I've been in this business 40 years. I started down a block for Kokkinides Gas, by the way. I'm in my neighborhood here. And I was able to sit there and watch Zeyneb present to me a tree where she slowly cut the branches off of the gas system, and then the trunk was the end. And I was still standing at the end, so I think we became partners forever and ever. But to me, the workforce at Eversource and the ability for us to pick up from a procurement, from a building, operating, maintaining underground infrastructure, it was in our wheelhouse. We did learn a lot, but we were easily able to transition. We had the customer relationships, we had the community relationships, we had all the billing capabilities, we have 24/7 operating capabilities to maintain these systems once they're in place. And we have an incredible sales and marketing team, which basically was able to convert its marketing efforts. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a later slide. And I want to duplicate stuff that Joel and you may have covered in a prior panel, but really, really important stuff. And that workforce transition is a big part of this whole storyline. So when you can effectively deploy resources that are doing gas work today into geothermal for the most part the following day, and those skill sets are easily transferable. It's a lot different than trying to transfer that skill set to doing electrification. So again, check on those two. Equity. You know, when you're building utility scale infrastructure, it's all about equity, right? When we do electric, we do gas, and you build at scale, you're making it available to a neighborhood. You're not just making it available to a single customer. So the equity issue becomes very strong. The alignment, as I mentioned, with decarbonization strategy, you know, decarbonizing not only the building sector, so obviously for Massachusetts, very significant goals and policies to decarbonize that sector. So the alignment there was very strong, but also the decarbonization value onto the electric sector. So cascading benefits in working towards decarbonization and accelerating decarbonization. The cost of operating the system, you know, in our early assessments was going to be low. As we were building it out, we realized maintaining an underground plastic infrastructure, carrying glycol water, an above-ground pump house, the bore fields, you know, all basically low-cost maintenance for a long, long time. You know, you're talking about infrastructure that's been in the ground for 50 years. And we build up plastic systems all day long on the gas side. And then the scaling issue that Zeynep mentioned. Clearly, the first project and the cost of the first project was high. We were conservative on our design. We did not want it to fail. We were learning as we were going. We're in the process through the grant that we received, that HEET received on our behalf, and the city of Framingham allowed us to design the expansion of that existing Framingham. The benefits, which I'm sure, Eric, you've covered in prior panels, amazing benefits to Zeynep's point about, and you think about how a gas system was built or an electric system was built, the synergies as you scale from that hub that you built originally. We're seeing that in spades. On the resources front, HVAC, the building conversion work is probably the beast. When you think about the building stock you're dealing with and the cost, and we saw it all in one pilot. Anything from asbestos to knob and tube wiring to inadequate service capacity, all the duct work. And from a regulated perspective, especially for gas companies, which used to have, and some companies still have, the kind of HVAC maintenance in their wheelhouse, you know, we need to think where that falls and how that is situated. In some places, that's a complete separation. And that's a big task, a lot of cost, and a lot of work required to address the building stock, particularly here in New England. Bill impact, Zeynep talked a lot about delivery versus supply sort of aspects. Again, low O&M. There is a big capital investment here, but again, in the scale on your supply side, it's really the electric supply you're looking at. The electric grid is under a huge path forward to modernize, build its resiliency, and address capacity. So when you think about the size and scale of a path forward of the investments being made, you have to then look at how geothermal can alter those investments and lower them, as well as the infrastructure, the fossil infrastructure investments. Site selection engagement, my clock's ticking here. I just say from an engagement perspective, as a gas company, convincing people to go to natural gas versus propane oil is a lot of known. People know the cost, they know the delivery, they know everything about it. They're making very informed decisions. When you start to introduce something like an option for ground source heat pumps, your education process and the time you spend to make sure customers understand, appreciate, because they're making big decisions. Not only when you're providing it free for everything, you're still going to be the thermal energy supply to their home or their business, and they care about it. So that education and the customer adoption issue, without customers, you don't have anything. So the work to get into what the customer's thinking is, to get them to understand what this looks like, feels like. I'm going to get the hook soon, Zeyneb. And my last is really related to all the kind of regulatory strategy and where those lands. It is very much integrated planning. You think about where the constraints are in the system, and I just do it an akin to what happened with solar. All the incentives to drive it solar were done basically to provide all kinds of value to customers randomly to go out there and install solar, which is great. But if you're the electric operator and you see solar popping up on your grid all over the place, it's very inefficient. If you were to say to an electric operator, where would solar best benefit the overall grid, they would point to places where that would be cascaded value. And that's the same way I see geothermal. In Mass, the electric companies had to do their ESMPs, their electric sector modernization plans. In there, you can see them calling out specific areas that you need the efficiencies of something like ground source heat pump, because the constraints and the build out is so much time and so high, the economics for ground source heat pumps immediately makes sense. So again, integrated planning cannot be something we discard as far as how we look at this and how regulators look at this going forward. I'm cocked out. I discuss. So thank you very much. Any questions? Joel and Erica here. Thank you very much.
Oh, should have taken notes. All right. All right, I'm Alex Buell, I'm Director of Utility Thermal Energy Networks at Con Edison. Real quick, Con Edison, we have a pretty, I'd say a pretty special perspective on the overall energy system. We have electric customers, gas customers, and also we're one of the largest steam networks in the country as well. And you know, as people have been saying, thinking about this, you know, as far as the integrated energy system is really important when we're talking about U10. I'll talk today, I'll kind of zero in on the New York State's regulatory framework, talk a little bit about where we've come from, where we are, and kind of where we're going. Very quick before, you know, a lot of these themes have been hit on already, but just wanted to share a little bit about how we're seeing the kind of the benefit and the potential for thermal energy networks in sort of a, I'd say, dense urban or light urban environment, you know, which is New York City and Westchester, well, most of Westchester. And one of the big things I'll hit on here is just, you know, especially in the city, and you look at Manhattan, electrification, decarbonization, you know, via electrification of heating, with the limited space you have in, you know, kind of these very dense, high load environments, you know, there's not often, especially with tall buildings, you know, the space to be cost effectively electrifying with air source heat pumps. And having, you know, thermal energy networks, you know, be able to come in can actually just can even enable the, you know, the possibility of some of these buildings decarbonizing. I'll say just the other point I'll hit on is with the lower electric system costs, you know, we agree really, really important value stream here. We've done some initial high-level estimates, but really do you see the reason, you know, the way these would pencil out in the right locations is about reducing the future grid build out that would be necessary if you're electrifying with air source heat pumps or other technologies, by having that higher efficiency of the thermal energy networks. So with, in New York, this stems from, the efforts here. A couple of years ago, the Utility Thermal Energy Networks and Jobs Act, UTENJA, was passed, and this did a couple of things. One, like a lot of the other laws across the country, it permits utilities to own and operate thermal energy networks, really, a lot of the same objectives that if you've been in these sessions previously, I think you've heard today. Emissions reduction, mitigation of the electric system build-outs, equity, a just transition for the workforce. And the way it kind of got started, kind of laying out the sequencing, the first step was requiring utilities to propose 1 to 5 pilots. And the idea being getting the data, getting the learnings to inform the development of the regulatory framework after that. And the way this is kind of played out, at the regulatory level, is a phased approach here, where the PSC is having utilities kind of first do feasibility assessments, then engineering and design, then get approval for construction, and then move to monitoring and data gathering. We're currently in stage 2. I think for all the utilities, so actively designing, engineering these projects. I know Cole will talk a little bit more about this, but pros and cons with an approach like this, kind of a sequenced one. It does kind of give good data each step of the way for the Public Service Commission to make decisions. The flip side is takes more time, and earlier on, Eversource was talking about customer acquisition being so critical. It does add a challenge of trying to sign customers up for something where you don't necessarily have approval to build. So, again, pros and cons need to balance these. Very quick, so we had to, this, I think it was August, September of 2022, there was the law. Very quickly, in order for utilities to develop and propose pilots. Because of the tight timeline, we went out to the market, both went to the market and then tried to rely on prior studies we had done, ran an RFI process, and really what we tried to do here, look for projects that fit the timeline, were feasible, aligned with the objectives of the legislation. And then really we're, after that, zeroing in on trying to just get a portfolio of projects that maximize the learnings unique to our, again, dense urban, light urban territory. So like, thermal energy sources, building types, customer types, density, all of those. We also looked at future expansion potential, and also, where possible, opportunities to avoid replacing leak-prone pipe. Coming out of that, ended up selecting 3 and are working on design on 3 of them. First one, Mount Vernon. So in Westchester, this is a geothermal-based thermal energy network with a whole mix of small light 1 to 4 family residential, light commercial, and some government in a historically disadvantaged community. Aiming to have about 76 buildings connected to it, and over 100 boreholes. And one of the things that we are piloting in particular here is 2 interconnected loops. And so scalability is important, and so the idea being see how already in the pilot understand how to build and operate interconnected loops, and then be able to have the capability to expand from there, kind of modular loop by modular loop. The only other thing I'll flag here, this is the pilot where there is an opportunity to avoid, to be able to avoid, the replacement of some leak-prone pipe. And so in that lower left-hand section, we are trying there. The challenge, as speakers have mentioned, I think a couple times today, for this to work, we have to have every single customer on there sign up. So we are going to be giving it a go, but it's going to be dependent on customers willing to fully electrify. So this was lighter urban. The other two pilots we have are in Manhattan, and in Manhattan there's not the space, the open space you have here for geothermal, and so what we're really looking to do in our Chelsea pilot and our Rockefeller Center pilot is utilize waste heat. We've done some assessments of waste heat, especially in Manhattan, and this is probably the primary sources of energy, at least at the start. Data centers, building HVAC systems, wastewater, subway, and potentially even in the future, the Hudson River. And so looking to really try and maximize the learnings there. And so Chelsea, this is tying a data center to New York City Housing Authority buildings to provide heating and cooling, as well as domestic hot water heating for 4 properties. And really, I think with this, it's about the that utilization of a waste energy resource and being able to get confidence that we can reliably depend upon a heat source that's coming from how another building is operating. And then finally here, Rockefeller Center. Iconic part of the city. Another waste heat project, in this case, Rockefeller Center. That complex is creating a lot of excess heat year-round. NBC Studios is there, for instance. And so this is about being able to tie Rockefeller Center, which has a lot of excess heat, to some buildings across the street which are struggling with decarbonizing. Again, tall commercial buildings, those space limitations. And so the utility being the intermediary here to be able to bring these two sets of entities together. Some of the success factors, just real quickly to date, like Eversource has talked about, meeting the customers where they are is really important. These pilots, as Zeyneb was talking about, they will be, at this stage, heavily subsidized. Customers, to get them willing to sign up for, a technology or set of technologies they're not familiar with. For the disadvantaged community ones, we will be covering all the costs up front, and we will be providing subsidies for the building work for the for the Rockefeller Center project. Also really important to acquire customers is assurance around the system performance, the bills that they are going to save on their energy bill, and this is particularly important for Mount Vernon. Making sure that in cases where you have the building owner being the customer, but you have tenants are being protected. It's different in different parts of the country, but a lot of places here, you'll have the landlord pay for the heating, the tenant pay for the electricity bill. It's not acceptable to have an outcome where we're doing a pilot and then suddenly having the cost of heating shift on over to the tenant, even if it's very efficient, especially in a lower income community. Cole, I think we'll talk a little more about this, but post-pilot, customers want to know what happens after the pilot period. So building those protections into our filings, that's a top priority for our team. And then of course, just again, state community and stakeholder engagement, can't understate that. The other thing I'll just say, just recognizing the scale of the effort, don't under-resource these. Complex work in the street, the building upgrades, incredibly complex, new rates, customer protections, real estate agreements, easements, the rate structures, all the above. It really does take dedicated resources and then the support from across the utility. So I have gone over, but I will just take one more minute here and just want to talk a little bit about what will be needed in a regulatory framework to scale post-pilot. And I think, first feeding into it, just echoing what people have said today, really getting that rigorous fact base that's grounded in the pilot learnings. So being able to say, where are these networks economic and attractive to customers so that we can then prioritize those use cases and then have that inform whatever the regulatory framework is to pay for them, recover the costs, all the above. And in that regulatory framework, I think the multi-value nature of these systems has come up, and it's going to be really important, I think, for to have the flexibility in that framework for U10 to be deployed wherever it's the right decarbonization tool for the job. And in some cases, the networks may be, we think a lot of them in our system will be more about the electric grid. Other cases, it may be opportunities where you can retire parts of the gas system, and making sure that the regulatory framework allows for the flexibility of ownership and operation that allows you to be able to take advantage of all the value. And I think just the last piece, it's events like this. You see, it takes a village or a city to make this happen, and so that cross-industry engagement is just going to be absolutely critical. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll introduce myself quick here. I'm Cole Burgess, project manager of the NYSEG and RG&E Utility Thermal Energy Networks. I want to know what the other sessions were, because I didn't expect this many people talking about standards at 4:30 on a conference. One uniqueness here is we do work underneath Avangrid, who is overseeing 2 of the utilities within the state. So we'll bring a little bit of perspective into that. So kind of for those not as familiar with the general service territories across New York, I do work for both NYSEG, New York State Electric and Gas. We have service territories that span across the state of New York, all the way from Buffalo up to Plattsburgh in the northeast and down into the Brewster area down in the southeast. We are a combination electric and gas utility, serving nearly 1 million electric customers, about 300,000 natural gas customers. And then also kind of within our network company is Rochester Gas and Electric, kind of centralized more in the Rochester area. We do have about 400,000 electric customers and about 300,000 gas customers. So kind of across the state, we've got a pretty diverse service area. We do have a lot of rural areas as well as a number of downtown systems that do serve customers existing. So I just wanted to kind of give you guys a quick preface here. Maybe someday we're going to have something that's not in Eastern New York for a state conference. They like to drag us out to Albany, downstate, etc. Western New York is nice. So yeah, just kind of compounding on what Alex brought to the table here. So kind of how did we get here? As alluded to, New York does have legislation that was passed that did require the New York utilities to advance thermal energy networks. There are different ways utilities can kind of get to the point where we can look to offer thermal energy service. So kind of as we've heard throughout the day, you've got legislation that can require or allow for utilities to come to the table and offer thermal projects to customers, or with certain states, you can propose a thermal energy pilot in a rate case. There is a lot of differentiation between these 3 approaches. That does allow for a lot of different kind of resource identification, different requirements for advancement as far as the overall project timing, and just kind of allows for a lot different kind of introduction into how a company steps into this new service type. Did draw out a couple of statements. These are not from ourselves, but actually our regulators. This is in reference to a couple of the kind of regulatory orders that has been published, but essentially it's kind of highlighting just some of the nuances here. I know our commissioners have stated that this is the first time in about 100 years New York utilities are putting a new type of energy service in practice. So with that, there is a lot of nuance that has been acknowledged by the regulatory parties, but we are here kind of working with this group as a whole, as well as you all, to define this well for our customers. So that brings us to kind of what we proposed. We do have 2 separate proposals, one in our NYSEG service territory, one in Rochester. Both are located within disadvantaged communities. With that, we've got a number of residential and non-residential customers. As Alex mentioned, we do have a lot of tenant-landlord considerations, both on the residential perspective as well as a commercial. That is a big part at play with kind of the customer dynamics we're facilitating with. So with our NYSEG proposal, we actually have a uniqueness in the state of New York here. We've got a open loop proposed system which leverages an underground aquifer for the thermal exchange. So you can kind of see highlighted in the red is the distribution system as last defined, and that does define a number of supply and discharge wells, 16 in total, which is a lot lower quantity of our overall wells needed to be drilled. We're able to extract a larger volume of energy through kind of a consistent flow of water versus leveraging the ground. So this is something we hope that we'll be able to scale across kind of that valley area in the state of, or the city of Ithaca. And then in Rochester, we do have a system very similar to kind of what Eversource has proposed and a couple of our colleagues across the state. This is a closed loop geothermal system, again, serving a mixed use area, 14 residential, 4 non-residential, 17 residential, 21 buildings. Disadvantaged community. So yeah, both projects come with their own nuances. We do facilitate across 2 different operating companies at the end of the day. There are delineations as far as the workforce is concerned internally, and want to just kind of highlight some of the collaboration that's kind of come into play here. So we do have, I would say, a very good working relationship with our regulators here. I've heard that's not always the case with certain utilities nationally. Want to kind of commend the fact that we do have a very close collaborative effort here. They keep our seats warm in Albany. We've had a number of technical conferences that allow us to kind of conform and define these things as we see necessary, as the utility, external stakeholders see necessary, and then our regulators as well. So we've got kind of performance metrics is one of the big ones. So how do we define the data? What is the data needed? And how do we capture it and report it so it's usable both for ourselves, the state, external stakeholders, and then you all as external parties to learn from as well as we kind of grow this nationally. As you'll see, this does take a kind of a lot of work is embodied in this. So we've got 4 separate sessions that ended up going into the technical conferences over a number of months, a lot of considerations there. And then as Zeyneb alluded to as well, you've got terms and definitions. These were part of our kind of overall standards development, so kind of making sure we've got uniform technologies as defined within the state, making sure that we've got kind of a legal framework that's set up that allows for us to kind of speak in the same commonality across utilities, something that our regulators can understand and abide by, and then something that our stakeholders as well. So some of these are kind of uniquenesses to the state of New York as far as what we are defining. So the performance metrics is something that we do have to abide by within our next stage 2 deliverable with the proposal. So how do we conform to all these performance metrics? There is kind of a litany of those. So you've got customer metrics required, you've got social metrics required, you have technical metrics required. So there are different categories of metrics. In total, there's numerous data points over the 5-year period. Interested to see kind of how that data comes together. There's a couple million data points in total. So there should be plenty of lessons learned from our systems for all of you guys to reference at the end of the day. So we're working with staff on kind of understanding what the requirement is for the performance metrics there. I will also highlight this is kind of an effort that does span outside of this as well. Staff and ourselves have acknowledged that district systems are in service across the state of New York currently, so that might be a steam system, that might be other forms of district energy systems such as central cooling, and there is a future technical conference that staff is looking to set up to understand kind of what is their best practices, how can we bring that into the thermal energy network space, and how do we kind of define something or reinvent a wheel that's already existing. So that kind of brings us to the overall collaboration at play. Some of these images you've seen before, so we're kind of highlighting the whole stronger together concept. So we're involved with bringing this to customers. Customers do have geothermal systems existing and are putting new geothermal systems in service every day. So we have had unique opportunities to learn from the construction of that, see what those systems are that are currently heating and conditioning spaces. We've had opportunities to leverage the local workforce that supports these projects. We do have to bring a utility up to speed on what this technology looks like, what the construction looks like. So we have been very fortunate with the local stakeholders kind of on the construction perspective to inform us of really what this entails. We are not the subject matter experts on this, but we're working to become that. And a lot of that has been through collaborations through entities like yourselves in different regards. So kind of as Eric mentioned, this does touch a lot of the utility. We did undergo a large mapping exercise, and by the time the projects are put in service, we've got over 100 different business areas that will be involved, some more than others. This is new work. This is incremental to the companies. We do have obligations to serve our existing electric and gas customers. So the resources is a big consideration, especially if this is being looked at of other states. This is incremental both to us and the regulatory parties here, so do not kind of underestimate this. This just kind of bringing some realism to the table of this is a large undertaking, does require a lot of facilitation across businesses, a lot of facilitation across the state. So make sure that kind of you guys are advised stepping into this of really what this entails, and just well informed to kind of develop the standards in the best way possible. So with that effort does also allow for concurrent activity to be brought into the frame of reference of what New York is doing. So we've got other entities here. We've got ICHPA, we've got NYSERDA helping collaborate on some of these efforts. On the workforce development, we've got the investment tax credit, which we are following as a company and hoping some different, I guess, definition by the Department of Treasury that's a little more flexible. And then we do have directives to leverage existing incentive programs across the state for project elements like building weatherization. So kind of culminating a lot of concurrent activity that ultimately is outside our wheelhouse. Leveraging those opportunities to kind of have a cohesive path forward is where we're working towards and looking to continue efforts on. But just kind of wanted to represent, I guess, overall what level of effort goes into this and the definitions of standards, so we have something that is uniform across the state that our regulators do have the ability to understand and kind of define how we serve customers. So on to customer considerations, as Alex stated, we do not have directive to build these projects as of right now, so every conversation there does need to be caveats of what we can define for customers. So a lot of discussions of we're proposing this or there's a potential for this that does bring uncertainty kind of to customers. They are excited about the clean energy, they're excited about the technology, certainly excited about receiving a centralized cooling system for the first time in a lot of these disadvantaged communities. But what does that mean for them if we don't really have those framework of definitions on how we are going to build this, when we're going to build this, due to kind of the state framework that has been put in place? Again, checks and balances there. There does allow for visibility on what's going on, but there are external complications that does entail as well. And then kind of within our customer agreement, we don't have a thermal tariff on this. So with our existing electric and gas customers, we do have defined service parameters that state how we provide electric and gas service that is not existent for thermal energy. So with that, we are looking to enter into a customer agreement with this. Those terms are specific to the pilot. So every single customer I've engaged with says what happens after 5 years, and we're as transparent as can be, but we don't have the full visibility on that because some of that does lie with the state and the commission at the end of the day. So that does kind of outline some of the external kind of considerations that we are working under with the state framework here. And then with the rules put in place, again, we don't provide thermal service today. So the state does have interest in seeing kind of what is the most equitable way to do this. How do we promote third-party competition? Those rules have been defined as initial rules for the state of New York. That was a collaborative effort with ourselves and as joint utilities, the state and the external stakeholders kind of as mentioned. And those rules are proposed for the initial pilots. So again, a little bit of just frame of reference of what we're doing for a specific set of time, and then hoping that the standards set by the state for rules are kind of uniform and bide well for customers at play. If we get a lot of questions, Max is collecting these. We're trying to get out of here by
All right, so let's get right to questions. We're a little over. We went a tiny bit over. So, any questions for our panelists?
Yeah, thank you. This is Gary Eubank with Gray Edge Group. I have a question to the utilities and to the whole group, okay? And so there's going to be two. One, to the utilities, how did you handle the expenses for the pilots? Did you expense the whole thing or what? That's one thing. Number two, the IRA has the ownership rule that has handcuffed and hobbled our industry and ground source guys. And so when we go into district, community ambient temperature loops, you have to own the whole thing, including the heat pump in the house. That is not equitable to all of us, particularly solar and others. So you have thoughts on that? Thank you.
I mean, I could do how Massachusetts treated the costs. Basically, it was unique pilot with a capital expense kind of budget established, and basically we're reimbursed, no recovery, no profit, nothing on that. It's a flat cost and recovery on that investment. Everything else TBD about what the future design looks like.
And in the New York context for Con Ed, we're proposing basically treatment like other investments we make. Whether it's the capital investments in the system or helping fund the upgrades in the customers' buildings. No. Proposing recovery amortization over time. Proposing through basically putting in a rate base and recovering from costs from customers. Yeah. And then on your second question, agree.
Yeah, from NYSEG and RG&E's perspective, same thing. Looking to recover the project expenses from the ratepayers, amortized. That determination will be made by the commission upon our stage 2 filing. So we are working underneath kind of a framework that's not been defined from the state on how utilities do recover the costs on the projects. And then we actually did, from NYSEG and RG&E's perspective, propose to own the HVAC equipment within the homes. We do see the investment tax credit as something we do want to leverage to lower our cost burden to customers. So that is a uniqueness as well of actually owning facility equipment that would typically be customers within their kind of premise or within their buildings.
So there's no sharing to the share owners? It's all rate-based?
On the second question, there's a panel tomorrow morning, the ITC panel number 1, which will plot out 2 pathways to try to address it. And on the first question, I just want to back up that the original intention is actually to merge the gas and GEO ratepayer bases. And in the beginning, that involves some subsidization of the GEO infrastructure going in the ground, kind of the way we did with gas. And then as you progress from like a 1% GEO, 99% gas to 99% GEO, 1% gas, there's a subsidization in the other direction. So those remaining gas rate payers don't get the spiking prices of a utility death spiral, thanks to the GEO that stabilizes them.
Yeah, hi, Brian Erlab, also Brian. Question for Alex. With Con Ed, when you mentioned the 2 pilot projects where you have off-taker customers where they're providing heat, can you explain a little bit about that and how you're negotiating contracts? Are they requesting or requiring you to pay them for that energy that they're providing to the system, and how that looks?
We're going to, because this is, waste heat that's, or excess heat being generated from, their building operations, we're going to need them to make some changes. And as a result, we're going to need to make it, we're going to need to compensate them for doing that. Overall energy system, this will, save money and reduce carbon. But in some cases, to capture that waste heat, they may need to use a little bit more electricity. And so, yeah, a thermal contract with compensation there is going to need to be one of the things we test for this. And what are the requirements, the obligations, the compensation level, all of that is being piloted.
Hi, I have a question for Alex about the Rockefeller Center project. So if you're recovering waste heat from equipment like chillers and other similar equipment, does that kind of lock in Rockefeller Center to stay using that type of heating equipment for a long term? And what if they want to change their building energy system? How does that affect this whole project?
I think with all the pilots, right, one of the challenges or uncertainties is technology will change and evolve, right? And we're going to be building infrastructure that's going to last a long time. So I think that's, for every pilot. Just for Rockefeller Center, it's their cooling equipment, so not their heating. And because they're so big and the way their loads work, they cool a lot in the winter. So it's not really changing, to get the energy how they heat. They will be, they will be making upgrades around the thermal energy network. And, part of we talked about meeting the customer where they are. At a pilot stage, some of that is, covering some of those upgrades to make them willing. Because you're right, there is risk and uncertainty there.
Super, thank you. John Thomas with Water Furnace. Just a little bit of an advertisement. I don't know if Ryan Doherty's in here. Geo Exchange Organization's well aware of the split ownership issue and what impact it's having on this segment of the opportunity for the industry in multiple aspects. I'm personally involved in that as one of the supporting OEMs just in DC 3 weeks ago. For those that are hearing about this issue for the first time, and we're lobbying and working with Congress to try to impart some wisdom in the Department of Treasury on their ruling on that. Second question, that's an advertisement. Second question is, for any of the utilities, are you considering load diversity requirements in evaluation of future projects? Because that's one of the key kind of fundamental physics elements that make thermal energy networks even more attractive to get you above that 6 target COP. Are you considering putting load diversity requirements in the evaluation of future projects?
Yeah, that was actually a consideration even upon the initial feasibility studies. So looking for a diverse load profile that does have kind of a centralized annual load that does balance over the heating and cooling seasons. So I know that across the state, there's been a number of projects that have kind of one large commercial customer that is cooling dominant, and then that offsets kind of the general neighborhood that is heating predominant. So that is kind of a general characteristic of what we're seeing. That is something that is more replicable, does reduce the amount of geothermal assets or thermal assets that need to be put in service. So that is something that is definitely on the utilities radar and will continue to be.
Yeah, same, totally agree with Cole. I think it's an interesting question about the future, post-pilot, right? Pilots were designing around this. What about in the future if you're scaling and allowing more customers to connect? I was reading one of the tariffs for a thermal energy network in Canada this morning, and it looks like they have a customer test, where they look at, if you add a customer, what does that do for the other customers in the system? And if it lowers their cost, great, add them. If it raises the cost, well, the new customer needs to pay. Not necessarily advocating for that, but it is an issue that other thermal energy networks are dealing with, and yeah, will be important.
Ditto on load diversity, but thank you, John, for the work on educating and informing and hopefully influencing DC on some of these matters. So thank you.
I'm so not a utility, but I'm gonna I'm gonna jump in on load diversity anyway, because there's some really interesting things when you get even bigger, and we're all just talking about these first projects. But what we're seeing with some beginning modeling is that if you go up in scale to 10,000 buildings, for example, you get a real cost savings and the ability to predict your load much more accurately, and your efficiency goes up because you've got so many buildings. And that was actually done by the World Bank Group, who are moving forward to invest in that scale in some developing countries.
Okay, I think we're at time. Thank you to our panelists.